The US is infamous for its North-South divide and always has been. Creeping into politics ever since the American Revolution, the conflict reached a violent crescendo in the 1860s with the secession of the southern states in 1861. Thankfully for the nation, the Union would defeat them after 4 grueling years of bloodshed. While the political divide has remained ever since then, for a number of reasons, the idea of splitting the United States never quite reached these heights again. However, this all begs the question, what if the South had won the Civil War? Could the Confederate States of America make it as an independent nation? Before we start, I want to make something very clear. I don't want to attack modern Southerners in any way. You're not responsible for the sins of your fathers, and I don't want to imply anything like that. However, the Confederate States were one of the most barbaric regimes of the 19th century, and I have no intention of sugarcoating that in the slightest. But, for some historical background, the two halves of the nation were on a divergent course as early as the American Revolution, with the northern states being more dogmatic about the independence cause and favoring a marginally more cohesive central government than the actual Articles of Confederation. This pattern would continue for a long time. The mercantile northern cities liked central banks and tariffs to stimulate their industrial growth, and were marginally less interested in territorial expansion. In contrast, the South, with its agrarian and morally abhorrent plantations, would be economically damaged by these practices, and these economic matters quickly became a political philosophy. States' rights, anyone? This was the impetus for the emergence of the Whigs and Democrats, respectively, though obviously most states were a hybrid of these extremes. But, to be clear, any economic or political divergence that swept these states was sourced directly from the slavery that allowed the South its fortune. The North was not bloodless either, with slavery being practiced throughout until the 1850s, and the South was obviously the source of the cotton for their textile factories, but let's not kid ourselves here. Regardless, tensions began mounting after the Mexican-American War, wherein the US took over the Southwest, lands like New Mexico, Arizona, and California. The surge of settlement out west caused tensions in the Senate, and the politics of the era were disappointing compromise after compromise, culminating in the collapse of the Whig Party to the new Republicans and slightly Whiggish Democrats. The election of 1860 saw Abraham Lincoln win on an expressly anti-slavery but not abolitionist campaign, and the South decided to take its ball and leave due to fear of abolitionism. The Union would have utterly terrible commander after utterly terrible commander, while the South actually had a pretty good run until 1863 when the lacking industry and logistics really started biting them on the ass. And that's where our divergence will start, the military situation. Like I said, the CSA had the tactical advantage while the Union had the strategic one, so we need the South to win quickly. Now, one of the first signs that the Dixie Army wasn't invincible was the Battle of Antietam. The battle was meant to be the start of an offensive campaign into the North, specifically Maryland, but George McClellan was able to stalemate them and force them back into Virginia. Yes, even with modern guns, logistics, and a 23k man numerical advantage, a tactical stalemate was the best McClellan could do. Now, normally I don't bother with intricate military details, but it seems to me that if Lee could force McClellan to fall back, as he did in a few other battles, the Virginian could probably dig in and be tough to dislodge, likely ravaging the area in the short term. Out west, the Union had better luck historically because Sherman and Grant actually knew how to fight battles and plan campaigns. However, in this world, we need to at least get rid of Grant. He was the best commander the Union had, and one of the best in the war as a whole. But if the South gets lucky during the Battle of Shiloh, where Beauregard and Albert Johnson were able to get the jump on him, they might be able to take Grant out of the picture. From there, the Union loses its best man for the Mississippi campaign, while the Confederates are occupying Union territory. We'll also have Johnson live on the southern side, since he wasn't a bad commander either. From there, we don't really need to mess with anything specific. Burnside might be able to pull off a few hat tricks, but as long as the Union Army lacks commanders, they can't utilize their primary advantages. While the Republicans likely retain their majority in 1862, if things don't change by 1863, the South will win the recognition of Britain and France especially will be willing to press the issue due to their Mexican puppet. And needless to say, for the purposes of this video, things don't change for the Union. Actually, no, in order to really drive the point home, we'll say that Lee, freshly invigorated after resupplying his troops and getting some new cannons from Antietam, is able to take Baltimore. As a result, Lincoln is defeated in 1864 by a peace candidate, and by 1865, the Union agrees to a treaty with the Confederates. Now, that particular move is a tad out of character by Lee since he hated logistics, but we'll say that Davis orders him to hold in the area to ward off any other Union advances for a bit, and then gives the all clear. Now, what does this treaty actually look like? Well, firstly, the Union is keeping Kentucky, West Virginia, and Missouri at least. The South probably hasn't conquered these areas, and they were loyal Union states despite slavery. Maryland is the only possible conquest, but I don't think that the Confederates would push that hard for it. They're trying to present themselves as merely trying to break free and live in the way they want as a free nation, and they know freedom because they have slaves. Conquering Maryland would run counter to that diplomatic strategy, and Davis isn't that stupid. Probably. Outside of territory, the Union is likely forced to return any escaped slaves to the Confederates, which will be a humiliation for the Republicans and cause tensions along the border, and likely a lot of anger in the more ardently abolitionist New England, but most Union citizens would likely accept it since they don't see the freemen or refugees as equal either. The only economic concern that the Union really and truly pushes for is that the Mississippi remains a neutral tradeway, since New Orleans is probably the only rival to the Big Apple at this point. And considering the draft rights and how we changed the war, it might somehow be in better shape. This treaty isn't a total Confederate victory in the slightest, since they do still need to give up on several states they would have wanted, but it's still a win for them due to receiving independence. Sticking with the South, though, what's their immediate situation? In a word, bad. In a sentence, suffering with inefficient central control and inflation. While most of the inflation began to hit hardest after 1863, and trade will pick back up after the war due to the end of the blockade, the Confederate dollar would remain highly inflated, and Davis wouldn't actually know about the problem until around 1863. Now, loath as I am to give the face of treason credit, Davis knew that he needed to whip the South into a functional country. He passed an export due on cotton, as well as attempting to push for a 5% tax on slaves and land, which would certainly help the Confederates balance the checkbook, if nothing else. The problem was that Congress, being made up of states' rights firebrands and wealthy aristocrats, was incentivized to add too many loopholes and credits to the legislation, which would undermine Davis. Plus, with this point of divergence, the question of necessity is legitimate. While the Confederate dollar is inflated, the fact of it is the Union invasions were stymied in a way that prevented the worst of the damages. So why does Davis need all this money? In addition, Davis quickly became unpopular during the war because of his attempted economic programs and defeats in the field, and that would likely remain the case here, at least that first part. In addition, the South is politically divided. While it didn't have proper political parties at the time of surrender, that process was underway, as is the nature of Congresses. In both 1861 and in 1863, Davis's allies had majorities, but they lost seats in 63. After peace, the question turned from wartime necessity toward peacetime nationalism and the same questions of central government as before. Now, Davis was more inclined towards states' rights than the Union counterpart, but being in the hot seat would have forced him to admit that having a functional state is useful. However, he also alienated a lot of Congress and his own vice president, Alexander Stephens, who you might know for being fucking appalling. Factoring in the one-term limit and Davis's unpopularity, the 1867 election likely goes to a conservative figure who opposed these same measures. Stephens is a good bet in of himself. Being a former Whig will give him some credibility as an opponent to Davis, in addition to his more traditionally Southern views of government. However, Stephens' term will be more of the same, the rich robbing the country, unstable currency due to inflation, and the fact that bonds are worth cotton. While the good was worth a lot, its value would probably be unstable, taking noticeable dips during harvests due to inflation. In addition, Stephens would be just as diplomatically isolated as Davis, with one possible exception we'll get to in a moment. As a result, Stephens will, unintentionally, vindicate Davis and his allies by showing what happens when you reverse the few reforms he was able to pull off. We'll call Stephens' group the Whigs, since they would be formed from the anti-Davis Whigs and fire eaters. They have very little in common with the Whig Party in the Union, or the British Whigs, being more or less the party of plantation elite in this new Confederacy, which isn't to say that the national party that emerges around Davis and his reformers is opposed to that group either. They're not about to argue for massive tariffs or a central bank or anything. They just prefer export dues and their taxes actually work. In addition, they likely have at least some more populist members, since they can point to the economy going belly up and say they at least saw it coming. However, industrialization or anything like that would still be a ways off, if we even assume the Confederates go that route. As a rule, both parties are to the right of their American counterparts. The question is the actual power of the federal government. If I were to guess, I would assume that Virginia, Georgia, and Tennessee, all of which had more heavy industry in their cities, would be swing states. Louisiana would be strongly national, along with North Carolina, and the rest would at least lean Whig, which is admittedly a little odd to say in relation to the South. Now, depending on how the war went and what the South's relations are with France, I could see them being friends with the Second Mexican Empire. The fate of Maximilian's regime is up in the air, especially since the Union would likely still give the rebels excess guns, but it's also just about the only friend they might have in the area. After all, the South is known to have expansionist goals, but Britain and France still don't like getting all their cotton from the slavocrats. So Richmond likely lacks major alliances with the two superpowers and has little diplomatic weight regarding the rest of the Caribbean. While Maximilian is a blatant French puppet, he's also the only person that doesn't hate the South for existing. Maybe. If the Mexican Empire chooses to back the South for its own regional ally, but still falls to the restored republic, things get messy in North America. The South would see factions advocating for reinstating Maximilian and taking land as compensation for the trouble, others that just want to take the land and tell Max to go to hell, and others who think that starting a war of conquest less than 10 years after the Independence War probably isn't the smartest. But a Southern Pacific port was one of the biggest goals of the planter elite for decades, so I think they'd at least try it. The question is the Union. War would be too unpopular, but they do have to do something. So I imagine sanctions on the South and guns to Mexico, but I'm not sure how well it goes. As a result, the South makes modest gains, but again, can't go full golden circle. Throughout the 1880s, I think the South would begin to industrialize by necessity. While export dues will have different domestic effects than a tariff, since I don't think it would be as inflationary, it would still stimulate local interests in processing it. In addition, I would expect a lot of tariffs from other countries like France, Britain, and Germany, who would all want to stimulate the cotton of their empires. India and Egypt alone would be able to compete with the South and be marginally less appalling. I said marginally for a reason. As the South industrializes, this will stimulate urban development, likely strengthening the nationals over the same period. However, let's not kid ourselves here. Slaves will be used just as much in heavy industry as in the cotton fields, especially in the deep southern states. Now, let's switch over to the Union. Lincoln is an abject failure, no ifs or buts about it. He's lost the South, and worse than that, wasn't even able to dent slavery in what was left. Don't forget, with the defeat at Antietam, Lincoln doesn't get the political capital to actually push the Emancipation Proclamation, and you can forget about enlisting black soldiers or passing the 13th Amendment. No, slavery is allowed to persist in all the border states, and the Union has lost some of its most lucrative exports. Now, Lincoln himself isn't at the treaty, since that's negotiated after his loss in 1864, but the fact remains that the only win the Union got from that is the Mississippi River's neutrality, and the border states Davis didn't even want. The nation is humiliated, and the Republicans are discredited, their abolitionism being blamed for the war as a whole and the subsequent losses. The Union Army is likely hit with a post-war depression to cap it off. Even if the South doesn't hit them with a war indemnity, they're still demobilizing a massive army, and they've just lost a lot of people demographically. In addition to finally having to admit to the loss of whatever gold is in the hands of Richmond, which will tank the value of the dollar. So while the Democrats likely went back-to-back from 1864 to some point in the mid-1870s, I would not expect Mr. 64 to be a two-termer either. Frankly, the main reason the Democrats went so long is almost entirely due to the disorganized nature of the opposition. Now, by 1876 or by 1880, the Democratic dominance will be weakening, similar to the Republican epoch of Reconstruction and the Gilded Age. However, this would hit Democrats sooner than it did the Republicans. The GOP was able to ride Reconstruction and the economic power of the Gilded Age to the White House for every election from 1860 to 1884, even if they had to withdraw from the South in 1876 due to the messy nature of that election. In contrast, the Democrats will have their era of dominance more or less due to the lack of an actual opposition party, not due to a victory in a generation-long political struggle. Well, I mean, I guess it is a victory, just not for the Union. The point is, in the 1870s or so, we'll see the rise of a new opposition party against the Democrats. Not to steal from Turtledove, especially since I haven't read his books, but I do think that the likeliest outcome is a pro-workers party. It wouldn't be the same as the real-life populists, since that group started in Texas and had inclinations toward bimetallism, adding a silver standard to the gold standard, and social conservatism due to that agrarian origin. The Workers' Party of America, or whatever they come up with, would be based much more on industrial labor concerns, and likely wouldn't feature bimetallism as a policy as a result. Now, the actual social details of the US are kind of hard to predict. I would still expect immigration to be a major debate, which probably sees the Democrats remain pro-immigrant and labor as nativist, but I'm not sure. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and we're closing in on 2K subscribers. If you've already subscribed and want to support me in other ways, I have channel memberships available to get early access to videos like this one. Thank you so much for watching, and let's get right back to the show. Now, the question is, when does the CSA abolish slavery? It's their reason for existence. It's the reason their path diverged from the rest of the US so early. Well, Brazil abolished it in 1888, and about 15% of the population was enslaved. In contrast, according to the 1860 census, the states that would become the Confederacy had about 9.1 million people, give or take West Virginia. Of that 9 million, 38% were enslaved, held in bondage, denied personhood. Even if we ignore the fact that the states in the Confederacy were outright forbidden from abolishing it, there wouldn't be abolition before the 1890s, and frankly, that feels a little optimistic. But by the 1890s, the South is in for a bad time. During the period, the South was ravaged by an outbreak of boll weevil that entered from Mexico. However, their conquests in that area could potentially bring the bug into the country even sooner, which would have horrific consequences. Even assuming that the outbreak only occurs on schedule, I would fully expect to see the planter class hit hard, and countless would be forced to sell their estates, and some would even be forced to free them. While this would be small, it would be the first major challenges the planters had seen to their political dominance in the Confederacy. Slavery will also begin to strangle the lower class white population. After all, why hire workers with their striking, their paychecks, and their children in school when you could just buy a whole workforce with the factory? You can even put the kids right to work when they're old enough. Don't even have to hire out the child laborers. Now, needless to say, that is fucking disgusting, but that is the calculus for most industrialists in the South, unless the Nationals can somehow ban industrial slavery specifically, I guess. As a result, there will be a struggle for non-wealthy white people to really advance, leaving most of them stuck in the military or their family farms, the ones that haven't been bought up at least. As a result, you'll begin to see a greater push from the working class to limit slavery. Back to Africa or Caribbean schemes will be very popular with this group rather than a clean abolition because from their perspective, that won't change their labor concerns. Now, let's zoom out a bit and talk about Europe. There likely aren't too many major effects on the continent as the result of the South winning. Germany likely still smacks France around and scares Britain, and by the 1890s, the Entente and Central Powers have likely formed as we know them. But it's a very common cliche to assume that France and Britain would continue to favor the South, leading to an Entente CSA and Central Power Union. While I'll touch on that a little, I don't think it would make sense. The Confederate States would be very interested in territorial expansion into the Gulf of Mexico, even if they probably don't try anything. In contrast, the French and British are increasingly anti-slavery. They're more so than the Union if we're being honest here, and have large Caribbean colonies. These colonies have lost a lot of value, and the black citizens therein are not treated well, but they are still citizens of those empires. To entertain the South more than the bare minimum is ridiculous. But playing in that direction, it's pretty bad for the Entente. The Union will have recovered by this point and will be just as dominant over Canada as ever, while still having greater industrial power than Richmond could hope for. Britain won't be able to use Canada, its most powerful dominion, to help defeat the Germans, and all that manpower and industry gets crushed under the American tanks. The South might hold out longer just because they have the Appalachians and the fact that the major cities are further from the border, but Richmond will still be occupied quickly, and the rest of the country probably only lasts 2 to 3 years. The Union terms will probably be pretty light though. The Canadian West Coast and parts of Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. The matter of the second Mexican cession is weird. I doubt the Union would want it, but if it's full of Anglo settlers, there's no point in giving it to Mexico. This is more or less what I've got. So what about the other way around? What about a Central Power South and an Entente North? Well, that would also take a bit of shenanigans. See, Germany was also pretty expansionist into the Caribbean and Latin America. It's part of what turned the US against them in our timeline. Add in the tensions in Pacific due to things like Samoa, and America decides to work with the bastard it knew, London, rather than the bastard it didn't, Berlin. And these same trends would apply to the Confederate States. Sure, Germany could offer them the Entente colonies in the Gulf if the South survived the war. Now, I want you to imagine the boll weevil-racked South, that while probably more industrialized than it was in our timeline, still has a third the manpower, rail, guns, or population of the Union, at best. Now imagine it fighting the Union mano a mano with the British Empire giving Philly moral support. Do you see the problem? I assume so. You're smart. I know because you're watching this video. Anyway, here's that treaty. The Yankees probably wouldn't want reunification at this point. It's been 50 years, the South is as different as Canada, all things considered. Also, they probably don't want to absorb too many black people because the North is also racist. Instead, they just take the areas that make strategic sense. Better control over the Appalachians, a monopoly on the Mississippi River, etc. In this timeline, I made the second Mexican cession a new Republic of the Rio Grande, since this US is taking all of Texas. The main exception is Baja California, which will allow the US to project power all over Mexico and Western Latin America with the assistance of the Panama Canal. In the case of either defeat, the South will be completely unstable. It would almost certainly become majority black with the loss of its western states and be ramshackled with some form of financial reparations. As a result, the 1920s would be incredibly rough for the nation, and its politics become very similar to another southern country with white minority rule. I won't necessarily assume that it becomes fascistic, but at the same time, that was widespread among other countries in the region with these agricultural minority rule-based politics. And the South is probably doing worse than a lot of them. Actually, no. It will be doing immensely worse than them. In the Central Power scenario especially, it would have lost its gate to the Pacific, and thus any trade it has with about half the planet, especially because it probably isn't getting any good deal on the Panama Canal with the US. This will also result in a lot of labor unrest, which could easily culminate in the right coalescing power. Or they go socialist, but honestly the Union would probably intervene if that seemed likely. Not under Wilson, he's a rando in the South here, but even the Workers' Party would still be worried about a revolutionary government in their southern neighbor. But like I said, I actually think that this timeline is pretty unlikely. No, in all likelihood, the South either remains neutral in World War I, or both countries join the Entente. Both sides have good reason to dislike Germany before the war and would be export economies more than a little annoyed about unrestricted submarine warfare. The South might join a little bit sooner than the Union. They wouldn't have the large German caucus that the Union did, would probably be more afraid of Germany after stuff like Venezuela, in contrast to the merely angry Union, and with their agricultural economy, their trade ties to the Entente will grow rapidly, like in Argentina at the same time. However, the CSA likely takes on a role similar to Brazil. They wouldn't really have their own agenda at the treaty, and more or less go along with the Union delegation. If they join meaningfully earlier, they might favor the British or French delegations over the Union's wishy-washy ideals just due to the cost, but from pure rationalism, the only thing they need to worry about is the German Navy, much like Brazil. Now, in this victorious South, the 1920s are unpredictable, but I'm still erring on the side of instability. We already talked about the boll weevil smacking them around earlier, so the outbreak of our timeline is either averted or just weaker, but it still could cause problems for the wealthy planters, whose power was really only broken by the Depression. So the wealth gap will likely only increase between the haves and have-nots in the 1920s. In addition, there likely won't be a great migration to the north, since the border will have solidified a bit more since the Civil War. The result is that the South remains more demographically African-American, while the North is a lot whiter. But a major question that arises from that is, are black Confederates allowed to serve in the Army? They never were in our timeline, and even the US Army was segregated, but this is an entirely different scenario. If they are, then coming off the heels of the Great War, the South will be met with its first genuine wave of civil rights protests. We saw this in our timeline when the American soldiers returned home from the Western Front, where European empires had more or less integrated armies, and that caused a bit of a stir back home. Now imagine if nearly 40% of the country was in that category, which at that point I think we can even argue that having to nearly double the actual amount of staff to even oversee a segregated army would cause some administrative tension. Of course, a widening wealth gap, labor, and civil rights unrest is going to cause some problems for the political establishment no matter how good the economy looks. There will be calls to actually allow the black population to vote, which are unlikely to be heeded anytime soon. Maybe Louisiana will allow it due to their higher than average mixed population, but I don't really know what that means for their local politics. Maybe Huey Long becomes president of the CSA, proving that he is inevitable. I feel like by this point, either the Nationals or the Whigs would see some backlash from more economically populist men like Long, but I'm not sure if they'd form their own party or they'd just be a prominent and bipartisan subsection of the major institutions. Of course, if we assume that the Depression happens as it did in our world, then those politics will get thrown for a loop. The 1927 election will be a major poison chalice, and the 1929 midterms will be a train wreck, likely resulting in the populist wing of the major factions breaking down. The men who in our world would be New Deal Dixiecrats would dominate the political scene for a while. I'm assuming that this version of the Confederacy more or less retains its democracy. Elections are competitive and populist, but they would be prone to very strongman politics, with egos and factions being almost as relevant to elections as the parties themselves. This sort of stuff was pretty common before World War II, especially during the Solid South, where the Democrats effectively ran the Gulf. While it wouldn't be as extreme here, it would happen. So what happens now? Well, honestly, I would expect that World War II goes pretty similarly to our timeline. The Confederates still have no reason to buddy up to the Germans, and the Union will get dragged in after Pearl Harbor. The Confederates would likely either remain neutral or join after Pearl Harbor. The vast majority of countries in the Americas only got involved from 42 to 45, and only Brazil or Mexico actually deployed men. They're the homies. I would expect that the Confederates would play a similar role. Minor actions in the Pacific, maybe a few men in North Africa, but otherwise they're just here to get into the UN. I won't bore you with the worldwide details, since I'm assuming that this timeline would have a lot of broad stroke similarities to our timeline, but I will say that I think the CSA will see its segregationist structure break down later than in real life. The 60s and 70s will be an era of massive political violence and instability. Frankly, it would be an actual border crisis for both the US and Mexico. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if the South was a major target of Soviet influence, trying to turn the largest state in the Gulf of Mexico into a socialist ally. But that, in turn, results in the American meddling escalating, and now the troubles are going to last until the fucking 80s. Making the US more nativistic and escalating the violence in the Confederacy. Instability becomes the new normal, and I could see a de facto revolution that tears down the Constitution and ruling government, along with the white rule that's held out for 100 years. From there, anything is possible, and I think I need to end the scenario here. We've explored the southern conquest of Mexico and their diplomatic alienation that only really ended in the First World War, and the rise of their early political parties that lasted to the Great Depression. However, after World War II, the CSA's white rule would be on its last legs, and it collapsed in the fire of the Cold War in the 1970s. The Confederacy is dead, but justice may yet prevail in the New South. Before we go, I want to give a quick thank you to Peter Darker, Trey, Now Fumato, Grimwalt, and Dubs Main for supporting me as channel members. And an extra special thank you to Peter Darker, Trey, Grimwalt, and Dubs Main for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, and join me next time as we explore another alternate world.